Good afternoon. I am Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA, and this is the briefest introduction ever because they each gave me one sentence. Carroll Dunham is an artist who has been working in printmaking for 40 years with additions from IFPDA members Harlan and Weaver, Burnett Editions, ULAE, and Two Palms, and this year's invitational exhibitor, JRP Editions. Dan Nadel is the Curator-at-Large for the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. His biography of Robert Crumb is forthcoming from Scribner in 2025. That was 2 sentences, actually, for Dan. And with that, I'm turning it over to them. Thank you very much.
Hi, Tip.
How are you, Dan?
I'm fine. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We're here to celebrate the release of Green Period, the book, and the accompanying lithograph, both published by JRP Editions. For an artist as focused on creating an object through a set of physical operations, printmaking was and remains an ideal medium for Carroll Dunham. The process-driven nature of printmaking goes to the root of a core question for him, which is how to paint a painting. We decided together to focus this talk on lithography, which not coincidentally is where he began making prints in 1984 at ULAE. In '84, when Bill Goldston of ULAE reached out to you, you'd been exhibiting for just a few years and you were making paintings and drawings on wood veneers. Goldston was working to appeal, and Bill Goldston is here, so I feel like you could tell the story, but I'll continue. Goldston was working to appeal to younger artists, and I've told you that lithography would break apart your thinking. He could have been thinking literally, since even if you had an image in mind, you'd have to break it into constituent parts, of course. But he likely was also thinking aesthetically and philosophically. So I wanted to start there. Was printmaking interesting to you initially when Bill reached out? Were prints in general interesting just as a viewer? And also, what was ULAE like at that point in '84 when he reached out?
I was interested in looking at prints. I mean, I didn't have a encyclopedic knowledge of print history or anything, but I think I knew that it was a branch of art that I'd like to know more about and like to try. The studio, when I first went there, was I think that's part of the reason that the whole thing took, is because the studio was very intimate and very easy to be in. It was in a house. And it was a small number of people around, so it didn't feel like you were in any way getting processed. It felt like people were welcoming you and helping you learn. But I really didn't know what my prints would be. I knew the work of the older artists that had worked at that studio, and I had a couple of friends who had started working there, but I didn't really know what it would be like for me.
And you started out with lithography.
Yeah, that was Bill's proposal, and I just kind of went with it. I mean, he knew a lot more about printmaking than I did, and the first art I was interested in when I was really young, like still really in high school, was photography, and so I came to painting more through learning about the contemporary art scene than through some lifelong feeling that I must be a painter. And I felt like printmaking could help me think about my paintings and just think about my whole approach to art in general. And Bill kind of corroborated that. I mean, you mentioned this notion of breaking images apart, but I think lithography is a really great place for an artist to enter printmaking, because it doesn't give you a lot of sexy stuff right up front. Like, as I've said to you before, you can basically look at an etching plate and print something, and it kind of looks sexy, but lithography doesn't really give you a lot. You have to really It's just a thin layer of ink, no surface qualities. It has surface qualities, but not in an obvious sense. And it requires a lot of analytical thinking, which tends to be kind of natural to me. So I guess when I think back on it, it seemed like a big struggle to get started, but I actually slid into it pretty organically.
Yeah, I would have thought for somebody who was already at that point, you were really working a lot with a specific kind of looping line, that lithography would seem almost natural for what your arm and your hand wanted to do.
Yeah,
anyway.
there's that, but the more of an obstacle was the fact that it's the materiality of it, like having this, hundreds of pounds of limestone sitting in the corner of your studio, like that's really different from a sheet of drawing paper.
Right.
I came to love that, but the real thing was trying to understand. I was making that all through the 80s, mostly I was making those paintings on panels with wood veneers mounted on them, and I was using the color of wood and the images in wood grain as points of departure for what I was doing. And we started out with the idea, I think, that there would be some sort of analog to that possible in printmaking. I remember for a while we were putting, ink on wood veneers and applying that pattern to stones and thinking that somehow we could build from that. And it all just felt like bullshit to me when we were doing it. It felt really forced. And it wasn't until I guess I did give in to what you're saying, just draw,
I mean, that brings us to the first print you completed, which is on the screen here.
I think that was the second print we completed and the first print we published.
Ah, okay.
And because I was working on a few different things kind of in parallel.
Yeah. And this was 2 stones.
I think it was a stone and a plate, maybe. Or maybe it was 2 stones. It's really hard. I was trying to remember this stuff when I was coming down this morning. And I think of my memory as being very complete about all of this, but I realized some of these details I've forgotten. It was 2 matrices. And the rectilinear image there in the center was the first stone that Bill had given me, left it in my studio in the city. And I had drawn on it for months and scratched stuff out and did all these things. And then we took it out to the studio on Long Island and they etched it, started to print it, and then I kept working on it. But this was, again, with all this different research going on about wood veneers and in the beginning there was a lot of sort of, spaghetti against the wall type of thing. And then I realized that the most interesting thing going on was really just this very worked over image on the surface of the stone, and the idea of looking for analogies to things in my paintings kind of went away.
And you found the medium for yourself.
I think so. I like I liked when I realized I could just, if we inked it in black ink and just printed it, it was just so printy. And I really liked that.
Printy.
Yeah, I liked that it was so printy. And it really didn't look like my drawings or my paintings, but it really looked like my work. So that was kind of a big realization.
Just an aside on the printiness, it occurs to me that, artists that you really loved, especially Jasper Johns, had worked at the studio and presumably on some of the stones, and Rauschenberg and Rosenquist. And was there ever, when you have a stone sitting in the studio that that other artists have worked on, even though it's been wiped, of course, is there something odd about that? Is it like having
I don't ever remember thinking about that.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember, I was very aware of the sort of morphic field of the studio, that people who I admired a lot and I thought had done great things already in printmaking had worked in the same room with the same printers.
Yeah.
I was more interested in the fact that the printers I was collaborating with, or the back and forth I was starting to have with Bill, that he had had these experiences, or they all had had experiences with these older artists, and I liked, within the bounds of decency, kind of picking their brains about that, but I don't remember thinking too much about the Stones per se.
How much back and forth was there between you and the printers at the time? I mean, were they feeding you a lot of information with which you could
Well, I mean, it's sort of blah, blah,
it...
blah all day long in a way.
Yeah.
You got to do something when you're in that room.
Yeah.
And, I would draw for a while because I was doing all of the drawing there. I mean, that's changed over time. And I guess as I got more confident, with more recent things, I might come to the studio with material already to show them. But back then, I was just coming in cold and working. And I think sometimes I wanted to be left alone, but a lot of times I would talk while I worked, and then we would all have lunch together, and then I would get a ride back to New York with somebody. So there was a lot of social exchange.
I wanted to ask you about Accelerator because I read about it, and aside from the subject matter, the ostensible subject matter, and the sort of particle accelerator reference, and the idea that that you're looking at two perspectives in a single sheet, the lengths to which you went to actually achieve this print were rather extraordinary because...
Well, it's a great example of the difference between just making something, say, with ink on a sheet of paper versus trying to... That's why lithography is a sort of construction process. The lower right third of the print referred to things I was doing in my paintings. I had done a number of paintings by that point on veneers that had a bird's eye figure in them, and I kind of extrapolated from that these brightly colored balls and rings that I made these cascades of. And when I painted them, it's just, you just keep painting over things. But I realized there was no way to really do that with a lithograph because it's so transparent. Mm-hmm. So we had to create this pretty complex set of masks to give the impression of overlap when in fact they all really exist on exactly the same surface.
Right.
So I painted these things with touche on sheets of Mylar. And then I'm sure we did use aluminum plates by that point because it involved, 7 or 8 layers of imagery all nested in together to create the sense of overlap, but they're really edges abutting if you looked at it microscopically. And I think I by that point, I was like, this is the third thing we finished. Mm-hmm. I was really into it. I was going pretty much every week to the studio, and we just went down a rabbit hole. It was a lot of fun. It was really, really interesting. And these different elements, which I don't remember if I made them all with the idea that they'd come together or if they kind of came together in the process of working. But there are 3 or 4 different matrices involved, plus the plates that make that what I just spoke about.
Yeah.
So it was several orders of magnitude more complex and complicated than what we'd done.
So that's interesting. I didn't realize that you were essentially making things for use at some point, but not necessarily for a specific
I don't think
print.
I knew that either necessarily, but I think I like the idea that, it's like if you imagine different things. I mean, I still think very pre-digitally. I worked as a layout artist at a magazine, so I think about light tables and layers of Mylar and things, looking through things and getting them into register. And I think something that appealed to me about this whole way of working was the idea that a sort of homeless fragment of something could find a way in and sort of fit. It's not a way you would think if you weren't working with things that in some way could be recycled.
Right. So after these 3, you're going out there almost every week. You've gone down the rabbit hole. What had you learned that you could then bring out to other areas of painting or drawing, or
Great
were you
question.
just in it?
No, great question. I mean, it had a huge, I've said this for years, I had such a huge influence on how I thought about painting. Because I kind of knew, I mean, there was a point where I knew that I was really getting tired of working on those wood panels. I was tired of always dealing with a brown field, and I was tired of just the whole setup. And seeing these prints emerge made me realize that I didn't have to feel trapped by this material, that there would be and also I remember thinking, like, I'd like my paintings to be more generically paintings. I think I was getting tired of the whole narrative of this, the specificity of the material that I was painting on, and it kind of, I was getting sick of the whole thing. So the fact that I had made these lithographs, that I knew that my work could look a different way, encouraged me I think, to have more confidence to think, well, you could just make big, colorful things on canvas.
Right.
And
right.
They could be painted in a way that isn't sort of ye old oil paint, schmutzy kind of thing. I knew that I was not that guy. And so, this is a great example of when I decided to try to figure out color in the lithographs, and I just became really enamored of these thin washes of very bright color. And it led me down a whole other direction with my paintings. So at that point, there was a lot of going, starting to go back and forth between.
Yeah, which sort of brings us to Red Shift.
Yes,
which
the first portfolio
reflects this kind of feedback loop of printing to painting to printmaking to, on and on. And this was 2 years, 18 stones and 22 aluminum plates.
Yeah. Yeah.
Saying that out loud, it seems absurd, but you were really
well. It was a long, involved thing, and it was the first proper portfolio that I made, and I think after we made the first 2 of them, we knew that we were going to make a portfolio, and I came quickly to love that form. I mean, I still think in a way portfolios are the highest realization of what prints can be. So it's not a very practical way to think, maybe, but it's a really beautiful way to think. And I didn't see this whole thing from the beginning. I really was just letting the process of working take me where it wanted to go. We had actually moved into for a while, ULAE had a studio downtown, so I was walking from my loft in Soho to this studio down in Tribeca, and we made this whole thing there, if I remember correctly.
Oh, so you could be really present in a way.
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean, I would go home for lunch sometimes. It was like, it was really good. And I should say, I mentioned that I had worked at a magazine, but I knew about four-color printing, and I knew about the idea that red, yellow, blue, and black yields an infinity of possibilities. So that was kind of my approach to color in the beginning when I decided I couldn't just keep making black and white lithographs. And so all of this is sort of a riff on very basic nameable colors: red, yellow, blue, green, black, purple.
Right, so you were in CMYK land, basically.
Not yet.
Initially.
Yeah, kind of, although not literally, but that was very philosophically very inspiring to me. I didn't want to sit around and match the color of this beautiful leaf for me. I just didn't want to think like that. I really wanted it to be like color out of the can.
Right. Native color.
Yeah, just what do they give you at the ink store,
Right.
And that's really how we did it.
Why are portfolios maybe the highest formed? What is it about portfolios?
Something about the idea that, anything could exist as a variation of itself. Mm-hmm. And that printmaking makes that very vivid, at least printing in editions does. Also, I guess I was starting to realize that when I was working on my drawings particularly, that if I have an idea, my way of getting to understand the idea is to just beat it to death. You've seen my drawing activities. I might make 20 little drawings that are basically of the same exact thing, just trying to burn into myself how I would draw it and to see if anything happens in the process. So there's a way that in printmaking you can kind of formalize that type of, call it, deep exploration, or call it, boring repetitiveness. It's sort of your choice. But
right.
With when you think about something as part of a portfolio, you have the possibility of a semi-narrative. Also, the idea that things exist in series that are bracketed by a set of concepts. Also, just on a sensual level, I love designing packages. Folders, boxes, albums. We've done all of that, and I find that very beautiful. So all that.
Yeah.
It's funny because in order to, if you were a person that was acquisitive and you wanted to own artwork.
Well, we've talked about this. Yeah.
To own print portfolios, it's interesting. You have to you've either got to have a really big table or, flat files or some way to keep these things, and you take them out and you look at them when you want to look at them.
Yeah.
So it makes looking at things somehow have more intention behind it too.
It does. It means that you have to set aside the time and the space to engage with something, which is a whole other kind of process than living with something on the wall.
Yeah, and you'll see, I've had the experience numerous times of museums, very happily, they might own a portfolio of mine, and they exhibit a few sheets from the portfolio in frames, and, that's fine, but that's not the same experience.
Is that, you don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, but is that frustrating on some level? Is it like,
I think maybe the first time I would never, I think within reason, any kind of interest is nice.
Yes.
I'm sure I could think of an example
let's really
of a type of interest that's not, but we don't have to.
We'll wait. It's fine.
Yeah.
Just go negative. I wanted to sort of move us forward a little bit because you completed a couple lithographs before taking a break. And then in 1996, we come back to Untitled, this Untitled piece, which is a bit more image-centric than before. And in 2000, a portfolio,
Well, you can see how my work, I think I don't remember the exact sequence or texture of things, but I know that my work was going through a lot of different stuff. I mean, you can see the difference from what we were talking about a minute ago to something like this.
It's a very different approach to color, of course, and just how color is held. Color and line just becomes something almost more fundamental or more minimal.
Well, I think I was in the process of giving in to, I'm not sure one ever gets to one's actual quote-unquote true self, but I was definitely giving in to some impulses and tendencies that I had that I wanted to be very blunt about. And so my work did get a lot, on the surface at least, a lot became more simplified, definitely more adjacent to something like subject matter, nameable. I mean, this is called female portraits. I was beginning to think a lot about what we now call gender as a subject for my work, a kind of axis of thought for my work. I mean, it's a perfect example of why I love portfolios, because how could I possibly choose one of those, and say, this is going to be the print?
Right.
I mean, I could have drawn those things for a week with my eyes closed. I was so in this area of imagery.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I had enablers who were willing to allow me to actually do this. So
when you're making something on this scale, and you have this relationship over at this point decades, do you look up for a reaction? Do you sort of?
Oh, definitely.
And what do you get?
Well, I call these people enablers,
Yeah, but that's one kind of reaction. I mean, what are there times when it's, go further? Are there times when it's a sad, quiet
moment?
Oh, do we have to do this? Or, I mean, what kinds of...
I've been extremely lucky in my relationships with people that I've collaborated with. And I only have had, and I couldn't work under other circumstances, because it's just the whole thing's too sensitive. I mean, I spent all my time making paintings completely by myself. I don't have people around me I have people maybe doing things so I can be by myself.
Right.
But no, printmaking is a much different, if you do it the way have done it. You're with people all the time. People are watching you draw. People are reacting to what you do. And the reactions are a kind of fuel. It's, the encouragement.
Yeah.
And then there's the level of what master printers know about how to make things that I don't know. So I'm kind of inputting imagery and a sort of, call it an ambition to go in a certain direction.
Mm-hmm.
I've had numerous experiences of not being told, this is horrible, but having it suggested, like that portfolio that we were just looking at, the original idea that was going to be etchings. And it could have easily, we could have made something as an etching that was based on those same images and even drawn and made very similarly. But it didn't have the same vibe. It didn't.
Right.
didn't sit right. The image didn't come home to itself in the proper way until we figured out that it should be lithography, and that came from the printers. So it's always this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems incredibly satisfying, I have to say.
I find it very satisfying, which is, I guess, why I keep doing it.
And then there was this portfolio that I'm sort of fascinated by because it's a different kind of line.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing, it was a huge thing for me. Bill Goldston had told me for years about this stuff, this lithographic transfer paper, which is an old material. It was used in the 19th century. What's it covered in, glycerin or something? Yeah.
Glycerin?
Yeah, it's like a paper that's got a surface that almost like wax paper. And the point of it is that you can draw and work on it with lithographic materials, and then there's a way you can process the surface off onto a stone or a plate.
So when you say work on it with lithographic materials,
well,
crayon or
yeah, I drew all these with litho crayons on sheets of transfer paper, and as I was making drawings, I was handing them to Bill and the other printers. They were transferring them to a stone and printing them, and so there was an immediacy and a directness to the whole thing that was kind of amazing. And it was, again, one of these things where I had this family of images in my mind. They're kind of, I don't know, I think a lot about this idea of homeless pictures. Like, I had made drawings at home that were a bit like this, and they kind of had something to do with paintings I had made, but the images didn't really find themselves until we got into this process with the transfer paper. And there was just something about the greasy black crayons, the I don't know what the word would be, the kind of delayed event of like, I made these things, you can say, oh, cool drawing, but it wasn't the artwork.
Right.
The artwork was going to happen a whole different way. And I was watching it all in real time. It wasn't like, come back in 2 weeks and we'll have a proof. It was very, very immediate. It was a lovely experience. So.
And a totally different kind of line quality for you. It
greasy crayons on transfer paper.
Yeah.
It's like if you took a crayon and drew on wax paper, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. It spreads differently.
Yeah, it's just different. It's got a different kind of resistance and slickness, and and litho crayons are very specific, because they're very greasy.
Yeah. You made a couple trees.
Yeah. These were very kind of nice, sweet little things, like very make the drawing, put the color in, print it. It was like very, I don't want to say easy, because none of this is easy, just very nice, direct.
I wanted to ask you about your borders. The borders in the prints, and then of course in the drawings and in the paintings, borders are very, very key to your work, and the way you've treated borders has changed over the years.
Well, it went through a little fluttery thought went past when we were looking at the first lithographs. I was thinking I should say something about borders, but then
caught it.
Yeah. It got good.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're communicating. Well, margins are completely, go out there and walk around, Like margins all over the place in printmaking. And usually that's just matrix edge to paper edge. In etching you have the plate mark. It's just sort of built into it. I had made drawings for a long time before I started really making paintings. I made drawings where I ruled off this little rectangle and put something inside. So it was always sort of a habit of mine. And when I, keep notebooks, and I'm like, oh, this could maybe be a painting. I, rule off a little thing. So I somehow from the beginning, this idea of what's the border and what's the image was interesting to me.
Yeah.
And with those first prints, there was a sort of keystone, which in a more normal print, maybe you just like, that's the image, and then there's this white border. But then I wanted to see what would it be like to like take the whole sheet over, but leave this idea that there's a border. So it started really early days of my printmaking. These are a nod to a sort of very generic idea of how an image floats in a sheet. Mm-hmm. More recently, as is evidence in the material in this thing.
Yeah, let's.
It's gotten to be a big subject for me, really. This idea of a rectangle within a rectangle, what mediates the space, where these two different kinds of edges talk to each other. There are a lot of different sort of interpretive levels to that I have been thinking about. That almost lead to different narratives, but it all originates with this thing I'm talking about, a kind of generic idea of borders and margins. The prints you just went by, those...
Yeah, I want to go back to those.
Those are kind of uncomfortable borders, because I think they're sort of uncomfortable pictures in some way. And I thought a lot about, debated with myself how to handle, I mean, these are completely blunt lithography, drawn on...
Yeah, I was going to ask you about what the process... I think were these during COVID? I can't remember if this
I don't remember anymore. 2020, so no, probably, no. I mean, they were made before that. I don't know if they were editioned during the pandemic. And they kind of went over into it, but I don't make a big deal about the effects of the pandemic on my art, so...
You avoid the...
I have very little to say about that.
No, but what's interesting here is that you went back to a more fundamental kind of, it's just a line on a sheet.
Nothing to see here. This is
just move along.
Just lithography.
Honestly.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, how were these made? I wasn't sure even what the matrix was.
They were drawn on Mylar, weren't they? Brian, did I draw these on Mylar? Maybe the first layer was transfer paper. That's right. And then I would add, I drew the initial sort of, I mean, you would recognize, there was nothing missing really. I made the drawings on transfer paper. Yeah. Then there were additions done on Mylar that we printed on separate plates.
Gotcha.
But this greasy black line is back to that same look of the transfer paper, how it takes a litho crayon.
Then we get to these wrestlers. And so it's funny, you said that they're uncomfortable pictures, so they're uncomfortable margins.
Well, they're too small to be sexy.
Yes.
And too big to ignore.
Yeah.
Or too wide to ignore.
And it's a chicken and egg thing?
How do you mean?
Well, when does the margin come in versus...
Oh, well, there's a whole nice thing about going from when you're sort of developing something and you at some point have to get real about what kind of paper you're going to print it on. which involves choosing sizes, surfaces, color, all this kind of stuff. I mean, paper is a whole universe. So I can't reconstruct it exactly, but I know that it was some sort of back and forth among the printers and me about what this looked good printed on, how we might have torn these sheets. I can't remember now, but we probably did and chose a size. I don't recall.
Yeah.
Because the image kind of was what it was. I know with this last thing, the green one, this last portfolio, we definitely.
Well, this went through all kinds of processes. I wondered if you could break that down, because I was fascinated by that process. Is a big subject of my essay in Green Period and the book, but it's also a big part of what you're up to in everything you're doing right now. This kind of imagery, the ideas behind it, the ideas of transference, of multi-dimensional space.
Well, as I said, at the point I was working on these, I went to the print studio with a lot of material already to sort of show those guys and see what we thought we could do with it. The basic setup of this over-the-shoulder profile of a male head and the green pigmentation of same, that was stuff I'd been working on in my drawings and paintings for a while at the point that this got started. But I had done a whole bunch of work at my studio at home using blotting as a way to work with watercolor. I've worked a lot with watercolor over the years, making monotypes with it, but the way that I use it is not in any way like normal watercolor painting. It's more like, squeezing stuff out of a tube and smearing it on like paint. Yeah. And then it's printed. But I love the material, and I love how kind of benign it is and the way that it holds color. And I've been aware that if I can't remember how it came to me, but I realized if I made a drawing and painted heavily on it with watercolor and with water-soluble crayons, and then I just soaked the shit out of the drawing, that I could take a big sheet of blotter paper and get essentially a counterproof of the drawing that had quite a bit of fidelity, but it had a very different look. Then I got into this thing. I got these big rolls of really good blotter paper, and I started making sandwiches where I would put a ton of pigmented material on a sheet of paper, soak it on a table, and then put layers of blotter paper on it. Yeah. And I really just wanted to see what it would look like. I'd take them all apart, and I realized after a while that these things were all in register with each other, like that they looked, by the time you're like a couple of layers away from the drawing, you don't really have the drawing anymore, but there's a lot of staining and really interesting, beautiful stuff. A lot of color comes through. And that all of these things, and also you got a front and a back thing. We haven't talked about that aspect of printmaking, the whole idea of images getting flopped. But having, trained myself to think like that, I realized whoa, all these things are in register, and if you flop the back, it's in register with the front. It's a little hard to talk about. It's much easier to see.
To see it, yeah.
So I went down to the studio at ULAE with all of these drawings of these heads and piles of these different sandwiches from blotter paper. And I thought, and we all agreed it would be interesting to try, to scan these different things, sandwich them all up in a computer so that on the screen you would see all these things as though they were all on top of each other.
Yeah.
not unlike looking at things on a light table.
Right.
And then we went through and made choices, like if you eliminate layer 3, does it matter? No, not really. But if you eliminate level 4, you lose this, or, you know. So we were kind of building these things in the computer. And then, how's this explanation going?
This is going well. I'm with you.
Feel like it's getting a little
Keep going.
out there. So then we had these images that were made of sandwiches of my
Files.
my blots,
Yes.
my blottings.
Yes, yes.
And then I started drawing on we printed those things, and then I drew on Mylar these boxy structures that would sort of enclose the whole thing. So it was this, you know, several stages of building this sandwich of imagery that all came together in the beautiful flatness of lithography.
Yeah.
And just clicked together, you know.
And they click together, but they have a huge amount of dimensionality.
Yeah. Well, there's perspectival dimensionality, and then there's the
Material.
the physical dimensionality, which is paradoxical because lithography is so thin.
It is, but somehow this process brought out an ability to sort of to layer it up, or at least create the illusion of layers of information and almost screens.
Yeah. Well, I felt like, and I mean, it wasn't conscious. It was just luck, really. That, you know, all these years of doing this stuff and thinking about it, something kind of clicked, and it was a total mixture to me of all the different. I mean, I knew I was sort of recommitted to thinking about lithography. I really wanted to develop it in a more ambitious kind of way. A lot of things clicked together when I figured this blotting thing out. But, you know, we were using computers. I was doing hand drawing. There was a huge amount of feedback from the printers to make it work.
Yeah.
So all the different aspects of what interests me about it kind of came together. And you can see in this one, this is the one that that's not part of the portfolio, the one that JRP has at their booth here. Also, what happens when you print a layer of white ink in lithography?
I was going to ask about that. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, that's.
It's a transparent layer, or just by nature?
White is. I mean, yeah, that's a. I mean, that's not. It is a transparent layer in the sense that you see through it, but it's a fairly strong layer of white ink in the lithographic medium. So that's it's a truth. It's a lithographic truth.
Do you?
It's not a trick.
Right.
It's a lithographic truth.
That you print this strong white and the black will still come through underneath.
Exactly.
And that's a big, I mean, that sort of idea of printiness, that lithographic truth.
We're back to printiness.
Lithographic truth equals printiness, maybe, on some level.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope if anyone who kind of knew anything about or thought about what they were looking at looked at this thing, they would kind of know it was printed.
Right.
You know, I'm not, I mean, there are prints I admire where you sort of can't always understand that it's printed. But I like the availability of that, you know? It's a whole story behind the object that
and letting that be apparent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you miss the stone lithography at all? I mean, is that appealing again? Having gone this far into digital?
Yes, in fact, I just had a little breakaway with my friend Brian over here about,
a breakaway meeting?
No, I've been thinking about how amazing it would be to just go to the studio and draw some stuff on stones.
Yeah.
just like full stop, you know, and see what that felt like. I haven't done it in years.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes.
I wanted to oops, to see if there are any questions before we wrap up. Questions from the audience? Anyone?
It's
Evie, yes?
I have a question for Tip.
What?
So
Nothing for me?
when I look at your paintings, and I consider you one of the greatest living painters of our time, the image seems, it's always something I've never seen before in like an incredible way. But when you look at all these prints that you're doing and all the drawings that you make, have you done, do you come to those images in the paintings because of all the printed images and drawing images? Like,
Yeah, 100%.
all of that is coming ahead.
100%. And I started to think, when I got really into printmaking and realized how much I wanted to pursue it, I started to feel like there's this like three-way tripod structure that holds my work up, like printmaking, drawings, and paintings. And sometimes one might be out ahead of another in the sense that I mean, you know, because I've made so many monotypes at your studio. I spent several years working on monotypes before I knew how to make the paintings that you would look at now and think, oh, well, they connect to those monotypes. And another artist might have made the paintings and then thought, oh, I think I can now make some monotypes. But I rely on printmaking almost and drawing like little laboratory settings to figure out if I really believe in something enough. Because I find painting the most difficult of all those things to do. It takes the most out of me emotionally and just on every level.
And you're alone.
And you're alone. Thank you. Exactly. Which on some level I must like, but I also really like not being alone. So it's one of my favorite things, as you know, it's one of my favorite things about print studios, is to be able to work and to not be alone, and to get some sense of another human being's reaction to what you're doing without having to go out and ask for opinions, you know. But yeah, it's all, anything you would see in my paintings is something that is building on all those different things.
That's probably a good place to stop, unless there's another question. Anybody else? No? Okay. Thank you, Tip.
Thank you,
Thank
Dan.
you, everybody.